Good morning, everyone. I'm Maria Kenneth Laurentino. This morning, we'll talk about the language status profile of Vietnam. Please follow me through the presentation that I'm going to show in this video. Vietnam is a multi-ethnic country and multilingual society. To talk about it more, let's see the language vitality profile. As you can see, the dark green represents institutional, the light green represents stable, and the red one represents endangered. For the language status, there are 54 different ethnic groups who speaks more than 100 languages. Among them, ethnic Viet or Kien constitutes 85.8% of the population. For their profile language, there are 47 Vigrous, 15 developing, 35 threatened, 5 shifting, and 5 dying. Let's take a look to their language status profile. As you can see, the purple one represents institutional. Then, the blue one represents developing. The green one represents vigorous, yellow and trouble, red, dying. Vigorous means it is used sustainably for face-to-face communication by all generations. Then the developing means it is vigorously with some literature form but not yet widespread. Then on the threatened, it is used widely by all generations but losing its user. Then shifting, it is used among childbearing generation but not transmitting to their children. Then lastly, the dying, meaning it losing its users. Let us now proceed to their language education policy in the early history. For a long time in its early history, Vietnam was seen as having no language of its own. But then, with almost millennium, under Chinese domination from 179 BC to 938 AD, Chinese language and its ideographic writing system was adopted as the official language of the country. The Vietnamese people were able to devise their own written form for their language using Chinese characters and called it Chuk Num. Although Chuk Num was based on Chinese characters to represent Vietnamese, it was not intelligible to the Chinese. Thus, it was considered as the instance of the people's resistance to the hegemony of Chinese language to protect the indigenous culture for Chinese influence. However, the growing influence from European priests and from French in the late 19th century, Chuk Num, as well as the Chinese character, were finally abolished and replaced by Kuk Ngu. In the early history, it was followed by the language education policy during French colonization. Early as 1858, there are French soldiers advanced into Vietnam, and 100 years later, Vietnam remained under the rule of French colonialists. The French colonialists made French the official language in Vietnam, the medium of instruction at all schools. They also promoted Kuk Ngu as the official written form of Vietnamese and used Kuk Ngu to get rid of the Chinese legacy and facilitate access to French languages. Any attempts to emphasize the teaching of Kuk Ngu in place of French, like in the case of Dong Ken Nhi Tuc, an institution established by Vietnamese intellectuals that emphasized Kuk Ngu and represented Vietnamese resistance to French rule, was considered as an act of rebellion. As remarked, this colonial language education policy resulted in a social division between those who spoke French at the top echelon and of the society and the lay persons who spoke Vietnamese. Good morning to everyone. To continue,
I'm tonight's reporter, Cleph-ReadWithMeOneChapterADay. Now we're going to focus to another language education policy of Vietnam.
Now, let's proceed to language education policy during divided Vietnam. The northern Vietnam, known as Communist North, and southern Vietnam, known as Nationalist South. The two divided Vietnam. In 1945, Vietnam claimed independence from the French. But Vietnamese did not become the medium of instruction, though it was commonly spoken language. When Vietnam claimed independence from the French, the first president of an independent Vietnam at the time, Ho Chi Minh, sought to fight illiteracy by investing in education. This was the time represented by the Romanized Quốc ngữ officially became the national language for Vietnam and the medium of instruction at all levels. That's why Vietnamese did not become the medium of instruction, because Quốc ngữ became the national language and the medium of instruction of Vietnam. On the contrary, French was still used officially in French-controlled urban areas. After the Geneva Accords in 1954, the French War ended, and that was the time that Vietnam was divided into Communist North and Nationalist South. And as an influence from communist countries in the north, Russian and Chinese became the popular foreign language. And this foreign language was first language established in 1958 to teach the university level, since the North government also issued order to stipulate that either Russian or Chinese was to be learned. In 1957, English education started to develop as continuous assistance was supplied to South Vietnam. Meanwhile, in the South, with the involvement of American troops after the French were defeated in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, English was required to be taught as an obligatory foreign language at school at university levels. In the South, English was taught as a living language with high integration of the cultural and political aspect of the language. And during the time, a bilingual use of both English and Vietnamese was mandatory for all government documents in the South during this period. However, in the North, foreign languages were mainly taught for instrumental purpose, and with a limited scope, the most widely taught foreign language, Russian, was mostly taught as a school subject, whereas Quốc ngữ or Vietnamese was strongly upheld to strengthen national independence and identity. Moving on, let's proceed to the next, the language education policy after the unification and Doi Moi. As we know, in Vietnam, they were divided into two, and that was the Communist North and the Nationalist South. In 1975, the two opposing pairs of Vietnam were reunified as the South Vietnamese administration was overthrown by North Vietnamese forces. The unified central government of Vietnam during the time aimed to renovate the country's economy by implementing the open door market-oriented policy in 1986, known as Doi Moi. Doi Moi, known as open door market-oriented policy, and also to emphasize the national sovereignty and solidarity, to embrace linguistic diversity, and also to support legitimacy of mother tongue-based education.
And in order to emphasize national sovereignty and solidarity, one of the measures for this was to promote Vietnamese, and it was written form called Quốc ngữ as a necessary means of communication among different ethnic groups across the country. And Vietnamese, next, the medium of instruction. During the time, the shifting political landscape also brought about changes in foreign language education policy, which is the extreme policy of burning and banning English textbook and French. About the extreme policy of burning and banning English and French textbook, don't worry about that. We will give you a handout and you are going to see that in our handout. And next, as a result, both of these languages were removed from the curriculum, and those who learned them privately or secretly could be punished and were immediately suspected of preparing to leave the country.
Thank you for listening. I hope you learned a lot from our reports.
And for more information, don't worry, we're going to pass in our GC the handout and the PPT for this presentation. God bless everyone.
God bless.
Thank you for listening and God bless.